Welcome. Welcome to the Women in Leadership Speaker Series. We are joined by Fotini Iconomopoulos, Angie Jackson, and Dion O'Gorman in our speaker series on the conversation on compensation. This is going to be a great conversation, and the format's going to be that we will introduce our speakers. We have a series of questions that we've created for them, and then there'll be question and answer at the end. Jessica Craig is monitoring our chat and Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to pop them in there, and there'll be time for that at the end. So thanks very much for being here. The presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to our Women in Leadership website following the event. And we want to begin today by just becoming present, coming here together, being in this space in time. So if you wouldn't mind just sitting back in your chair, take a moment. We are all so busy these days, running from one thing to the next. Take a moment to ground yourself. So I'm going to invite you into a short 2-minute practice of breathing and grounding. So if you feel like it, what I like to do is close my eyes. If that doesn't feel comfortable for you, feel free to gaze off into a point beyond, out into space. Join me in closing your eyes, resting your shoulders, letting yourself sink into whatever it is you're sitting on, and start breathing really deep. So when we breathe, we want to fill up our stomach through the nose and then let it all out. Let's do that 3 times together. So really inhale and let it all out. And a 3rd time. And let it out. That might be the first time you took a really nice deep breath in possibly hours. So keep your eyes closed and imagine yourself surrounded by warmth and sunshine. Imagine yourself as a tree. Whatever type of tree comes to mind, something really sturdy. And just imagine how you grow up through the earth, your branches extending to the sky, your leaves branching out, tickling the air as we bloom into spring. And feel yourself being warmed by the sun, nurtured by the water and the rain, and now flow back down from your leaves, down your trunk to the earth. And imagine your legs growing like roots down into the earth. Extend your toes like little shoots that go out into this moist, rich, nourishing earth, where everything you need is available for you. Just take a moment there to breathe that all in. The warmth of the sky, the nourishing of the earth, all of what we need is with us. And take a nice deep breath there. And exhale. And while we're here, before we open our eyes, I'd like to extend our thanks to the Indigenous peoples on which we work and play and live. I'm broadcasting from Victoria, so I'm coming to you from the lands, the unceded lands and territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Coast Salish, the Esquimalt, and Songhees nations. We extend our respect, honor, and thanks for allowing us to be here today. And now take a deep breath in as you open your eyes. We'll come back into our present moment, grounded and ready to listen and learn. I want to go back a slide, Jessica, and just introduce Women in Leadership. Just briefly, we are the Women in Leadership Foundation. We are the Victoria chapter. There are chapters across Canada. And it was founded in 2001 by Maya Kennigan. She founded the Women in Leadership Foundation, which delivers inspirational programs that bring women together to collaborate in the development of their leadership skills and creates positive change in the future of women's leadership. With an emphasis on mentorship, there are several great programs that you can learn more about on the website at womeninleadership.ca. Thank you very much. We invite members and non-members to subscribe to our e-newsletter and to attend our events, many of which are free. All right, so we'll get started now. I want to introduce our speakers. Fotini Iconomopoulos is an author, speaker, negotiation consultant, and Forward Focusing Inc. Dion O'Gorman is the Director of Consulting Services at CGI, and Angie Jackson is the Talent Acquisition Lead at CGI. I want to invite our speakers, to tell us a little bit about themselves in a brief introduction. So we'll change that slide out, Jessica, so we can see our speakers. Thank you. I'll call on Dion O'Gorman first to introduce herself briefly.
So hi, good afternoon. My name is Dion O'Gorman. As you've heard, I work for CGI as a consultant, as a director of consulting services. So what I do mostly is I'm out there negotiating with clients for contract work most of the time. Prior to that, I've spent many years in IT as a woman, negotiating my way through, including running my own business, negotiating my own salary. So compensation is important to me. Over to you, Fotina.
Thank you, Fotina.
So my name is Fotini Iconomopoulos. I have been a negotiation consultant for over a decade. Before that, I had a career in manufacturing, working for companies like L'Oreal and Smuckers, negotiating with Walmart buyers on a regular basis. Last year, I wrote a book I wrote it a long time ago. It came out last year, called Say Less, Get More, to try and help folks like you find ways to be more successful in your negotiations and overcome any fears that may hold you back. And I spend most of my time these days crisscrossing the globe, mostly in North America, speaking to large audiences about how to get what they want. Occasionally I teach MBA negotiations at the Schulich School of Business, but I especially love speaking to women's groups to try and close the gender pay gap before it gets started.
Thank you. And Angie Jackson.
Hello, everyone. So first and foremost, I'm a mother, a spouse, and a new grandmother. And I think that's all primary to the career, but I think we're here really to talk about our careers and compensation today. So I come from a very long background of technical IT and aerospace recruitment, joined CGI in 2009. So hope to end my career with this great organization. And I talk to people all day long about their compensation requirements, their aspirations, what they want to do furthering on their career. And so I have developed some great insight into that over the years.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to learn more from you ladies. You mentioned the pay gap, Fotini, and we have a slide, Jessica, which outlines a few facts about the pay gap, just to put a container around what we're talking about today. Most women probably know this, but there is a 76% pay gap. That is, women make 76%. The pay gap would be 24%. We make 76% of what men make on an annual basis. And the gender pay gap persists even though women now outnumber men in pursuing university degrees. And the gender pay gap impacts women of all stages. So from summer jobs to pension gap, where women retire with only 80% of the pension men retire with. the pay gap is worse for those who face multiple barriers, including Indigenous women, women of color, and women with disabilities. So that's the container that is still in 2022, the state of affairs. So we want to talk about some of the issues that face women, that create some fears around compensation. And it's one of the primary issues that women often note as a barrier. So we'll begin by asking, with the general idea of how we can close this pay gap. I want to ask you, Angie, first about job hunting. So what sources do most employers use as a benchmark for their compensation?
Yeah, so it depends on the industry and the sector that we're looking at. If we're looking at consulting as an example, here at CGI, we look at when we're considering an external hire, certainly things like education, the relevance of their job history to the current role, equity among people of similar background and experience on the team. We look at market benchmarking as well. What their contribution value is today versus their potential for growth. And obviously, being a consulting organization, we look at their billable factor. How much can we charge a client for the work that they deliver? And so all of those factors combine and have different weights at different points in time and for different skill sets as well. But generally speaking, all of those factors come into play, and we really look at averaging those out when we're considering what we'll be offering an external candidate.
Okay, so all of those are benchmarks. How would you factor in, how would one factor in their own experience compared to a job posting when determining what end of the salary range to ask for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's most pertinent for women when they think about their value to an organization or their potential value. Really, it's looking at your own proficiency level against the requirements of the role. If you have some experience with the key areas of responsibility, but still require regular guidance, coaching, those kind of things, consider starting at the lower end. And likewise, if you're able to coach others, you would justifiably consider being at the higher end of the range. Something else to take into consideration, though, is if you feel like you've mastered most or all of the role, it might be a consideration that you should perhaps change your objectives to a higher level position and be realistic about that.
Thank you. Excellent. Moving to you, Fotini, how would you answer the question we're often asked of what are your compensation or salary expectations?
So this is one that I feel like most people freak out when they hear, because they go, I don't want to answer that. I want them to tell me. And the only reason to be afraid of that question is if you haven't done your homework. You should, before you go into any salary negotiation, you should have done market research. You should know what other people in your industry are getting paid. There's so many resources that were already mentioned where people can go to find that information, but talk to others in your industry, talk to others in an organization that you're keen on, or a competitive organization, to find that out. If you know that, then you go in armed with information, and information is power. So if you know the average person makes X amount for this, your answer should be higher than that. And I tell people this because that's an average. If you are not an average person, if you are a high performer, if you are an overachiever, and I suspect if you are signed up for this event, that is likely who you are, do not diminish yourself by asking for the average. So the answer to that question is always starting with this credible response of based on my research, based on my knowledge of the industry, based on some credible information. You don't need to source it. You don't need to cite it. You don't need to tell them who told you, but you just need to sound credible, saying you came prepared for this meeting. Based on my knowledge of the industry and my experience, here's what I would expect. And I want you to go higher than the average, because if they say, look, we can't afford that, then you say, how close can you get to that figure? If you are going in there and being collaborative, if you're going in there and being credible and not asking for some ridiculous number, when I say, ask for higher than average, I'm not saying go double. I'm not saying go 50% higher. I'm just saying go in with something that is credible. Put yourself at the top of this experience if that is who you are and what you are bringing to the table. Because I suspect if you are applying, you are probably going to be pretty damn qualified for this job. So I'd say start with that credible information and then give them that number. This is also one of the only times I recommend people give a range. I don't like using ranges in general. I think they can diminish your credibility, but in this case, it can make you seem like you are trying to be flexible and cooperative. However, even that range is going to be strategic. So that range is the bottom end of the range is going to be your aspiration. When you say based on whatever, it's going to be X amount that you're trying to get to this other amount that you know they're never going to agree to, and that's totally okay. But if you say based on a lower amount, why would they give you this high amount if they know you're willing to accept the low amount? So you can still seem like you are being cooperative by giving a range, and I don't want you to discredit yourself by not giving yourself that opportunity to achieve that more than average number.
Thank you. I've heard statistics that, and maybe this is in your book, about men asking for higher amounts typically than women go in asking for.
Yeah.
And I take that as an excellent starting point to remind myself that whatever I'm thinking of asking for is probably on the lower range. So bump it up a bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you. What a great answer. And on that point, how do you bring up the compensation issue if the interviewer doesn't?
There's always a time and place for such things. You don't want to rush it. It's kind of like dating, right? You don't want to go in for a kiss before it's appropriate. And so if it looks like things are getting serious, if it looks like it's going to lead to a next step, or they're about to put together an offer for you, if they give you the green light that an offer is coming, then it's appropriate to say, hey, you know what? There's something that we haven't discussed. I'd like to make sure we're all on the same page. Based on my research, someone in my experience level and so on would expect this amount of compensation. What does that look like on your end? What are your expectations? So you can enter into this cooperative conversation, but I would say don't rush it until you know. If they say things are great, you've had all your interviews, they're like, great, you'll hear from us very soon. That might be then, or in the next few days, we'll get an email over to you. That is your time. If they haven't had an opportunity to raise it, you want to be the one raising it. There's a power in going first when it comes to salary negotiations in general, but all negotiations. Research after research shows us the anchoring effect. You anchoring them to a number is going to work to your advantage. Once they put that proposal out there, it's going to be really hard to pull them away from their number. It's going to be much easier if you've anchored and planted something on their subconscious to have them working towards.
Great. And Dion, what are your thoughts on companies posting salary ranges on platforms such as LinkedIn? There's quite a debate around this. What are your thoughts on that?
I definitely am a proponent for salaries being posted, salaries being available. However, if they're not, this is where you really do need to do your research. Call your friend network up, look at Glassdoor, take a look and ask people what they're making, to understand what the salary range is. I think as women, we don't ask each other and we're not transparent with one another about our salaries. I think it would do us a lot of good if we did talk more about salaries and what compensation looks like in each of our different roles. It would help a lot.
Yes, great. And Glassdoor, can you just tell for people who don't know what that is, what it is?
Well, if you Google salary expectations, you'll often see Glassdoor. About half the time you have to go in and actually sign up, which is fine. But it will give you an understanding of where a company ranks and as far as their members actually seeing their satisfaction out of 5. But it'll also give you a salary. If people post it, people can actually post the salaries based on their job. And you can see what the average or the range of salaries, including compensation, benefits, and potentially other types of compensation that the company offers.
Thank you. Angie, I have a question for you next. How should one determine the compensation for contract work?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So contract work is normally paid out on an hourly basis. Shorter terms typically can command a higher hourly rate than contracts of a longer duration. For a full-time 40-hour-a-week type of contract, the hourly rate's usually 0.1%, if you will, of the usual annual salary if the role was permanent. So for example, if you're looking at $50 an hour, it would typically equate to about a 100K type position if the role was permanent. Consider that contractors don't work always a full 2,080 hours a year. So there's, the responsibility for all of your own expenses, taxes, healthcare, et cetera. So that should factor into the hourly rate that you're looking to have.
So higher, obviously. Yeah. On the topic of research and evaluation, Fotini, you talked about this earlier. And the first question is going to you again, Angie. How do you prepare for compensation reviews? For example, what research should you do? What information should you be prepared with? And where do you suggest people go to find the most accurate salary research to prepare for negotiation?
Yeah, and I think Dion mentioned Glassdoor is a really good source of information for that kind of thing. But basically, in my view, preparation for reviews is really an ongoing activity throughout the year. It's not something you typically do 15 minutes before your review. You want to be looking at, your successes and documenting them, any strong performance that comes up, recognition, any time that you stood out or went above and beyond that brings attention to your performance are things that you should bring to the table and prepare them for salary negotiations. Basically demonstrating your value to the organization on a daily basis and be ready to talk about that during the review time is also really important. If the organization isn't really candid about compensation ranges to its members, there are lots of sources of information, your friends, your colleagues, people who work in that sector, as well as Glassdoor, the Job Bank Wage, Outlook site, Monster, those kind of things, but really to be prepared to go into those negotiations long before you have to sit down and talk about them is really key.
Thank you. Dion, how do you factor in the non-monetary types of compensation?
I know we were talking about this earlier, and I think compensation, every single form of compensation has a monetary value to you. And I think if you look at it in that regards, you have to figure out what the value is to you and put a dollar value to it. And if you don't value it, then obviously it shouldn't be something that you add into your monetary compensation. For example, if you value vacation, well, how much does that vacation actually mean to you? 3 weeks or 5 weeks? Look at that and actually put it into dollars, put it into a dollar figure. Benefit plans, so pension. If pension is important to you, put the dollar figure for it as to what that pension would look like for you. Things we don't talk about is long-term incentive plans. I know, having been a director for a few companies now, there are long-term incentive plans that are given at different levels if you're in your career, and you need to put a value to that. What does that mean to you? Having stock options, having vacation days, having the ability to work from home, all of those factors, you need to quantify them. You need to put a dollar figure to them, and that becomes part of what you value your work as.
Okay, thank you. Fotini, do you have any suggestions for how someone can compile data about their work performance or the value that they add to the organization?
I use something, and I advise others to do the same, called what I called a feel-good folder. And so what that means is every single time someone gives you praise, every time someone says thank you for something that you've done, an accolade from a client, a boss, a peer, anything like that, you want to put that, or even a result of some kind, you want to put it in this folder so that you have all of these great accomplishments ready to go in chronological order from other people's mouths. So it doesn't feel quite as icky when you're talking about your accomplishments because it came from someone else. I have been in situations where I've worked with clients on the regular, and I remember being down in Arkansas with a client. Both of us were traveling to go see her team, and we were hanging out together in the evening, both of us working on our computers. And she's like, "Oh, I'm preparing for this end of year evaluation, and I don't even know what I did this year." I go, "What do you mean? I know what you did this year. I've been coming here every month and watching you work with your team. You did this and this and this and this." So think about those things before the end of the year. I think it was Angie who said, this happens all the time. So keep track of those things, every single thank you, single project that you've worked on. And I think it's really important to make sure that you measure things quantitatively as well. There's a really great TED talk by a woman named Susan Colantuono, and I can never remember the title of it, but I remember Susan's name because we've chatted. And she talks about the fact that women are not quantitative enough. We talk often, we praise ourselves, or we talk about the things that we do that are more cultural in nature, or about being cooperative or a team player. But I want you to think about, what did you do and how did it affect the bottom line? How many meetings have you been taking? How many client reach outs have you done? How much did that contribute to profitability? How can you connect that to the overall results of the company? So have it in your feel good folder, make sure you've got it all laid out, and connect that to a company objective that is going to be valuable to them. They may undervalue some of the soft skills, even though they're extremely important. For some reason, they're just not seeing them that way. So speak in the language that's going to make sure they put you on the pedestal that you deserve to be on.
Thank you. Great advice. And Angie, on a similar note, what tips do you have for advocating for yourself to help highlight how you're credible and worthy for an increase, and how an increase would not only benefit you, but the company as well?
I think I could literally say word for word what Fotini just to explain to us, but really hanging on to every email, every note, every kudos you receive from a client, a colleague, a manager, anyone in the organization who recognizes your value at any point in time. By the way, I call it my happy file. One that I store all of my kudos in as well. Soliciting input from those with whom you interact most. So if you're not getting a compliment or a kudo, and you work really well with somebody, and they may have told your boss or someone else about your great performance, get that input from them, get them to put it in writing for you. And it's normally will be very constructive feedback that you'll get that you can utilize at that time. And again, to Fotini's point, use real examples of where you've had an impact on the business using data, dollar savings, performance of any product or system that you've put in place, statistics, cost reduction measures that you've put into place, anything that really has an impact. And as Fotini said, speaks the language of the organization or the person that you'll be interacting with during that performance increase or pay increase time.
Thank you very much. Moving to timing, how frequent should you review compensation with your employer or contract supervisor? And this goes to Dion.
So when it comes to review, usually I suggest twice a year. Doesn't mean that it has to be twice a year. If there's some big change that has occurred that you feel that you need to review compensation, i.e. maybe your job or your role has changed, it's doubled in size or something like that, then take that time and review your compensation. And when I talk about reviewing compensation, ask where you fit. How do I fit in market statistics? Where do I fit? Am I at the top, the lower, the high end? And sort of have an open discussion and try to get as much transparency as to where you fit in the benchmarking for the company as well. I've done that, and I've found that quite successful at really pushing the compensation conversation.
Okay, great. And what, Dion, this is for you as well. When's a good time to ask for a raise?
Anytime. If you don't ask, you're never going to get anything. And I think one thing, and I've talked to many of my female colleagues, we don't ask enough as women for what we want. So ask and ask away. The worst you're going to be told is no. And even if you're told no, find out how to get to yes.
Great. Fotini, building on that question, is there a certain amount of time one should wait after starting a job before asking for an increase?
There's no magic number, but I would say the ideal time is when you're just coming off of a win of some kind. So if you've hit a milestone, if you worked on a big project, if you got some great accolades from someone, it could be as early as 3 months in, it could be 6 months or a year down the road. I'd say a year is probably too long, because I think it was Dion who just said, ask for those mid-year evaluations, get that feedback. But I'd say when you're riding high on a really big win, that is the opportune time for you to do it. If you're waiting until the end of the year or those evaluations, you're probably too late, because what happens is at the end of the year evaluations, they've already decided a month before that, a bunch of executives sat in a room somewhere and said, hey, we only have so much to give away in increases this year. Who should we give them to? And everybody starts fighting for you. And that's when your champions start doing all the work. That means a month before that, you had to be in someone's ear going, hey, here's all the great things that I've been doing, so that they can go ahead and fight for you and get that budget for you. If you're waiting until that time when they come to offer you something, it's going to be really hard for them to go back and fight for you. So come off of anytime during the year when you're coming off of a really great high, when you've got something to celebrate, that is your moment to talk to your boss and go, hey, here's some really great stuff that I've been up to. I'd love to talk about my career development. I'd love to talk about what my compensation is going to look like and how I'm matching others and how it's going to get more competitive and so on.
Great, thank you. Now we'll move to compensation review tips. What should, and this is for you, Angie, what should one say and not say when asking for a raise? Like, are there any words or phrases that we should avoid?
Yeah, so what you should say in general is use facts and data, demonstrate your value. And those are all of the points that you need to put across when asking. I think some of the things to avoid, some of the things not to say have anything to do with sort of how long you've been there and the fact that you deserve it just by virtue of the fact that you've been there the longest, for example. Comparing yourself to others in a similar role. So-and-so makes more or less than I do. Definitely, it shouldn't factor into whether or not you're looking or being given an increase in salary. So I think basically stick to the facts, stick to the good reasons why you were worthy of the increase or the salary adjustment, and then stray away from the more subjective, if you will, points.
And no comparisons with others.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Fotini, what should one do if the compensation request is denied, and how do you begin to negotiate?
I think Dion scratched the surface on this one. If they are saying no, then your next job is to ask when and how and what would the next steps look like. So no is not the end of the negotiation. It is the start. This is your opportunity to tee off part 2 of the negotiation. If they say not now, okay, if not now, then when? If they say, I don't know, later when we've turned the business around, this was something I heard during COVID when things got really bad at first, when the business has improved. What are the milestones? What kind of markers are you looking for? What in your definition is an improvement? Get really specific information so that when that milestone is very obvious to the both of you, you can go back and say, hey, remember when you said when we hit 6% growth? Now that we're there, let's talk about that thing that you promised me 6 months ago or whatever it was. So get really specific. If they say when you have more experience, well, what does experience look like to you? What type of experience are you looking for? I think Angie mentioned get super specific. This is your time to get super specific, but you need to be ready to ask lots of questions. No, before you go in there, anticipate a no, have those questions ready, write them out, practice them in a mirror. If you get the yes, fantastic. But if you get the no, at least you'll be ready instead of stumbling over your words and doing this deer in the headlights moment where you go, what do I say? Be prepared for that moment instead of letting the power escape, because you have an opportunity there to get lots of knowledge, and knowledge is power. So use it.
Thank you. Dion, is there anything that you should do once your request is approved? So is there follow-up to that?
Well, I think there's 2 things. You need to thank the person for approving your request. I think you need to show gratitude and be humble about it. And I also think you need to, on the other hand, is you need to get it in writing. With everything happening, and as everybody's aware, there's a lot of movement right now in the industry, in different industries. People move. So you could have a boss that's your boss 1 week and 2 weeks later was no longer your boss. So have it in writing. Make sure you follow up with a conversation. If someone has said yes, you follow up and thank you very much. Just confirming, X, Y, and Z to what we agreed to. I think that's an important thing to do, especially on compensation.
Yes, great. Thank you. And one final question. To all of you, what is the question that you are most tired of hearing on the subject of compensation? And what would you like to say about it so you never have to answer it again? Angie, Fotini, Dion?
Sure. I can jump in.
Yeah.
Truth be told, I never tire of any question. I talk to 5, 10 candidates a day. Everybody tends to come at their question around compensation really from a totally different place and with different motivators. So you really have to be listening to what might be behind that question, and try to answer it in a truthful and factful way as much as you possibly can. And if there's any concerns or fears around that, try to address them and allay them or support them in what they're going to do next relative to the question that they've asked.
Fotini, is there any particular question you're so tired of answering?
I hear this question all the time from people in my Instagram inbox, from my MBA students, from all sorts of people I meet all over the world. And it is people going, "Are you sure I can? Can I negotiate it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you can. You deserve to be there. They're giving you their time for a reason. And if when you make that effort, they are not responding appropriately, if they're being vague in their answers, if they say no without an excuse or without a timeline when you've done all the great follow-ups, that should also be a big red flag to you, that they're not being collaborative, that they're not being forthcoming, for you to go, this is probably not the organization I want to stay with forever. I need to start plotting my exit strategy. If you are managing things collaboratively in many of the ways that we've all discussed today, you're not banging your fist on the table trying to be a jerk and saying you must do this or else, and they're not responding in kind, going, hey, let's open up this conversation. We can't afford to do it today, but let's talk about when we can. Then they're not the place where you want to spend much more time. So start plotting your exit strategy, but you can negotiate.
Thank you. Dion?
I think I'm fed up of hearing about compensation gaps between men and women. And I'm in a hiring position, I see other women's salaries. I've promoted other women to director levels. I think for me, it's about taking care of it when you see it. I have mentored and coached and talked to women about their own compensation as their boss and where it's at and where it needs to go, how to get them there. Because I think it's also when we are as women on the other side seeing that we do see, I'd be honest, the last 10 years, I've had at least 100 people report to me, and I have seen pay discrepancies. And I don't just let them slip by. I actually talk to the person. I've talked to HR about it. I'm involved in trying to help other women understand where their pay is and how to get it where it needs to go. So I think it's being aware of it, but I'm really fed up of hearing it because it's, as they say, it's 2022. There's no reason for it anymore.
Great.
Women are just as equally qualified in every single way. We've just got to ask and be proud and help one another out, quite frankly.
Yes, an excellent argument for more women at the top. Thank you. Those are great answers and appreciate all of the advice. I'm sure that our attendees have questions, so I want to turn it over to Jessica, who's been watching our question and answer chat. Are there any questions, Jessica?
There are a few. If anybody else has questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A. We'll go through what's in here, and hopefully people will put some more questions in here as we go, and we'll get through as many as we can. We've got about 15 minutes left. But first of all, thank you so much for everything today. This has been so great. I feel like I'm just a little sponge, just collecting all of the information. The first question that we have here says, my employer has added job tasks to my job description, but has declined an increase in my salary. What is your advice to deal with this? And we'll just put it out to everybody. You can kind of jump in and popcorn.
So, I mean, I'd love to know more context about why they declined the increase. I would be going back and asking questions about, now that we have more, you really need to build a why for them. Now that we have more budget, since so-and-so is no longer doing that job, or if we're not hiring another headcount, What can we do to make sure that I'm being paid competitively? What can we make sure that this is sustainable? I like using the word sustainable because it triggers a couple of things. There's an underlying thing that says, if you don't treat me right, I'm going to leave, without having to be threatening. But it's also going, I can't do this forever at this pace, at this compensation. So what are we going to do to make sure that I don't get burnt out and it doesn't serve you well? You really have to look at things from the other person's perspective, which is really hard to do, and especially when you're frustrated and you're going, but why aren't you paying me more? Why aren't they paying you more? You might have to show some empathy and go, hey, I understand budgets might be tight right now. I also want to make sure that this is a sustainable endeavor, and that I feel as though I'm being compensated appropriately with my peer group, or compensated appropriately for all the work that I'm doing. What can we do to make sure that this is something that is going to work for the long term? If you put that question out there, then you're going to put them on the spot to try and come up with solutions. If they don't try to come up with solutions and they're very closed, that's a very telling response as well in terms of the culture and how long you want to be there. So those are a few of the ways I would handle it, but it really comes down to asking more questions about that.
I think that was super helpful. Hopefully we answered your question. If you want to put more context in the chat, whoever asks that, it's anonymous. Feel free to do so and we can come back to it. Angie, Dion, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for selling oneself when you're looking at what your task list is and your duties and responsibilities. I think a lot of women tend to take on a lot more than they really should in a role. And very often we'll just continue to do it and work overtime and do it late at night and just keep doing it without actually highlighting, because they feel like, well, I might be perceived to be complaining or not happy with what I'm doing. But highlighting the efforts that you put in and the results that you bring will really bring forward just how much you have on your plate and what your workload really is. And if those tasks do take over your life, then it's really a point of as Fotini said earlier, looking at what are my options out there.
And I think one last piece to add on that is to be careful about additional tasks, in the sense that it depends on if you want to be promoted. You're looking at increasing your level in the company. Be very clear with your boss about additional tasks and making sure that they align up with your own personal development and where you want to go in your career. Because often what happens is we say yes, 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 we take on more, and someone else gets promoted because guess what? We haven't been able to focus on the areas in order to help us improve and develop and become a stronger asset in the company. So be clear and be careful and have an open discussion about your personal development and how additional tasks focus in on your own career objectives.
I love that advice from both ladies. One thing I'll add to that is I just did an interview last week on City TV on breakfast television. I just posted it on LinkedIn today or yesterday, and it was all about office housework. So when you're talking about these extra tasks, you can have those conversations to go, great, I'm thrilled that you want me to do things. Of these other 10 priorities that I'm working on, which one should I deprioritize to make room for this thing? Because otherwise you're going to end up in burnout central.
I love that. That's such great advice. Our next question is, do you have any thoughts or tips for negotiating a salary what is above what is on the job posting already?
For me, this is just a repeat of what I said earlier. Go in there with your research to say, hey, great, thanks for this posting. I'm thrilled about it. Based on my research, what's out there, what's competitive is actually up here. What can we do to close that gap, or how close can you get to this figure? As much as we'd like to believe that every company is being transparent and saying this is their max, they're not always. There's usually a little bit of wiggle room left with most organizations. I'm not going to say all, but there's usually a little bit of wiggle room. So if you ask the question in a collaborative way and you do it credibly, based on my research, this is what is the most competitive. What can you tell me about how to make this offer more competitive, or how close can you get to that? Then you're engaging in conversation, you're engaging in dialogue, as opposed to what's going to feel like a very combative negotiation. You do have to take into account that maybe they're smaller, maybe they're a startup, maybe they're something else. Then it goes back to some of the stuff that Dion talked about. What other things are going to help to close the gap of compensation? Are there other things that are going to save you money? Can they cover your cell phone bill, some travel expenses, parking, transportation, work from home? home other things that would keep more money in your pocket to close that gap if they don't have more budget. But go in prepared with some of those creative opportunities, those creative options. Go in prepared for a conversation, but anchor high and make it credible.
And some of that research, at least what I found very useful, is actually getting in and knowing people within the organization that you want to work for and having that open discussion about what are salary ranges internally, what sort of other compensation benefits can we look at, and really getting as part of your research, really understanding from those that are already there what's available to you, so that we are well versed on the company culture and as well as what the company can provide for you.
Most people are pretty cagey when you do talk to them about salary. I think we all agree that talking to people internally is really important, but not everybody's going to want to share stuff with you. So you've got to be careful about how you ask. So you don't say, what did you make? You're going to say, what would you expect for someone at my experience level? Now, all of a sudden, you're not asking them to divulge something confidential and make them uncomfortable, but you can still get some clues and some indices about what you should be expecting.
There's a follow-up question here that's a little bit similar, so if we can tie it in. It just asks, can you expand on what is meant by putting a dollar value on vacation time? So similar to these other things that are non-compensation, what kind of dollar values would you attribute there?
I can take that one. It's a simple math question. Divide your salary by 52 weeks, and that's 1 week's salary, 1 week's vacation for you, really. That's what the actual value is to you. And to the organization as well.
Yeah, if you had to take a paid week off, then what would happen? Like if you had to cut out salary for a week because you needed that extra week of vacation, but they're willing to give it to you for free, then, that is a monetary value you can attach. The other thing is too, like if you need some downtime because you're going to lose your sanity, otherwise, you need to decide how much of that is worth the gap that you're talking about. Are other people willing to do that? Or is this the only company that's willing to do that? And how much is that worth to you?
That's great. I think that will be helpful. What would you recommend? What would be a recommended follow-up to a situation where an employee is now promoted and the pay offered is less than what the previous person was compensated for by a sizable amount, assuming the qualifications and experience are similar? So I think what this question is asking is someone has left and they've got promoted to this position, but they're getting paid less than the previous person. If that's wrong, throw it in the chat. I'll fix it.
I have some thoughts about this, but I feel like I'm constantly jumping in. So ladies, just interrupt me if you have something else to add.
Go ahead, I'll jump in after you.
So this is one of those things where you can, again, be quite credible and you can say something to the effect of, it's come to my attention that others have been compensated more for similar tasks. What can we do to make this equitable? What can we do to make this sustainable? You don't need to rat anybody out. You don't need to say who told you and so on, and I wouldn't involve them. And if they ask the question, you say, I don't think that would be appropriate. I'd rather keep this conversation between us, but it has come to my attention. And so I do think it's important. I want to come here feeling valued. I want to make sure I know I am more motivated, more productive when I am coming and knowing that I am valued. So what can we do to make that a reality? How do we make sure that I feel like this is an equitable workplace? That is really putting the pressure on them, but doing it in a very cooperative way and calling out some of the bullshit without having to say, how dare you? You don't want to be that angry person. You want to be a collaborative, discussion-oriented, solution-oriented person.
And in the spirit of that collaboration as well, just like you said, do your research, make sure that what your assumptions on the other person's experience and qualifications being similar are really that. And that they didn't, leave with a great deal more experience and ready to take on a new role at a higher level as you're entering into that role and being promoted into it, and do perhaps have some growth that needs to take place in order to be at the same level as they were when they left. So really, it requires a certain kind of navel gazing, if you will, or looking at yourself in the mirror and really being realistic about the comparisons before you take it to the individuals you need to talk to.
And if they say this other person was experienced, then that's your opportunity to map out the negotiation in the future and go, what can we do? What should the plan look like for me? How do I make sure I get there quickly? What do we do to work towards that? How do I close that gap? What do you need to see from me? Ask those questions so that you all have transparency about what it's going to look like to get there.
And I'm going to be devil's advocate. If you still don't like the answer, it might not be the right fit for you. And that's where you need to understand your own value and not be afraid. Chances are they'll offer you more money when you ask you're going to leave, but don't go that approach. But I'm saying, you know, you need to value your worth, right? And not be afraid.
I think this next question kind of ties into that quite well. And it seems to be a bit of a sticky topic that we've talked about a few times. They've said, I struggle sometimes with evaluating how some of the external constraints in my life, such as supporting family or health constraints, should or should not affect my overall value in terms of compensation. So I think that ties into knowing your worth and what's most important for you. It seems to be coming up a few times. If you have any more thoughts on that.
Sure, I can talk personally a little bit about this. I've had all kinds of situations where I've had to look after dying family members, starting a business, having brand new children, you know, people where I've been traveling around the world. I still remember being asked, well, you know, traveling around the world, is that not going to impact your children? Are you sure you can do this? Like, that wasn't that long ago. I think you have to be true to yourself in whatever your values are. And you have to be clear. Don't be afraid to have an open conversation with your boss and tell them where you stand and what's important to you and what you're capable of doing and what you want to do. And that has no, doesn't have a negative view to a good boss. If anything, your boss should be working with you to help support you in growing you within a company and helping you achieve your goals and your own personal development as well. So I'd be more transparent with the boss and not be afraid of it, and be very clear on what you need and what you want in order to be successful in your role. And your family life is part of that. You know, it's who we are. And I think through the pandemic, we've seen a huge change in what's acceptable now and what's understood as far as our own mental health and our own well-being when it comes to the workplace. And I think that has definitely helped quite a bit in solving some of the issues we've had before.
You need to, one thing I'll add to that is you need to know what we call your break points. You know, what is your break point in terms of, this is too much time, this is taking away from my family, this is taking away from my social life, and so on. So break points in terms of how much energy you're going to give something, and break points in terms of what's the trade-off. Like, this much more money isn't going to make me that much happier. There's no magic way to do that, but you do need to have almost like a heart-to-heart with yourself and go, where are my boundaries here? What do I need in order to do this? One way that might help is looking at, again, doing that market research and going, are other people asking for more for this kind of thing? Am I being paid well for this? That might help you to go, I feel valued or undervalued. That just might be one indicator that can help you get there. But it truly is, and it's an intrinsic search.
I think that's super, super helpful and really important to know, to figure out what is important to us and what we need to do to understand our own worth. I've got one more question here, and that'll probably wrap us up, so we've only got a few minutes left. Do you have any thoughts on incorporating inflation and the cost of living into annual compensation conversations?
I'm going to be really repetitive on this one, but it's going to be based on, it's going to be the very first words out of your mouth. But I would start with, what are all your accomplishments? Work on the merit piece first so that you can get their heads nodding and go, yeah, you have done a really great job. Then you can go, based on the fact that inflation is at 8% and costs are rising, how much more can we do to make sure that I'm compensated for the extra work and the merit, and so on and so forth. That's how the order of things that I would go in. I want to get them going, yes, you do deserve a raise. Then you can throw in the inflation bit so they realize you're going to have to make it more than 8.5% to make it feel like a raise. Otherwise, you're just barely covering my cost of living. Anything less than 8.5% is basically a reduction.
Indeed. Nothing to add to that. It was a very thorough answer. Question though from Stephanie Anglin, I believe, on the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Actually, another one just came through as well.
I think they're This is a follow-up to the previous question, and I think we have a few minutes to answer it for her. If the salary gap between the person who is hired and the person who left is significant, so even at 25% of an increase, it still wouldn't close that gap. What is your advice in that situation, if it's different?
I would say this is the same thing that I can't stand hearing employers say, well, you were paid this much before, look at how far you come. And I go, that is not the reference. Or if they ask you a question about what were you getting paid at your last employer, it makes no difference. We're talking about the job today. We're talking about making sure I feel valued. We're talking about making sure that this is competitive and that this is sustainable. So when they say, but that's such a big gap, and yet at the same time, you're going to go, and at the same time, it's still not on par with my peer group. It's still not competitive with what's going on in the market. How do we make sure, again, that how question, that what question, how do we make sure that I feel compensated and this is a sustainable scenario? That's how I would be handling it. You dismiss the fact that where you started, that doesn't matter. Now that we know that this is the new bar, this is the market, this is what is competitive, this is what is fair, and it's okay to use the word fair. How do we make sure that this is fair and equitable? Those words are really hot words that you're putting them on the spot, because nobody wants to look like they're being unfair, and nobody certainly wants to look like they're not being equitable, because that's a human resource issue and that's a human rights issue as well. So if you can drop those words in and do it in a collaborative way, again, asking those questions, being curious, don't be defensive, go in with a curious attitude, then you're going to get a lot further. But the starting point doesn't matter. The reference point is where you're supposed to be, not how much they were underpaying you before. So you can even say, like, I appreciate you recognizing how underpaid I was being. How do we make sure I'm being paid on par with my peer group or where I'm supposed to be?
There's sometimes, though, a cultural compensation matter within an organization. For example, an organization that supports government, and they're restricted and constrained by the rates that they've already put in place by their contractual agreements, and margins and things like that they must respect from a corporate perspective. I think that it would be wrong to say that the organization doesn't value you based on the contribution that you've made if they can only go that level and that depth or that stretch to offer you a compensation that's significantly more than you were earning and significantly more than the cultural compensation adjustments that organization provides every period. And really understand, why am I staying at this organization? If I could go next door and earn X% higher, are there good reasons, non-compensatory value or non-dollar value compensation, that make it so I want to remain in this organization? Is it the people I work with? Is it the people I work for? Is it the project work that I do, that yes, I could go earn more money somewhere else, but still not have the growth potential or the learning that I may have in this organization? So I don't think compensation is the only thing that we really need to pay attention to when making that consideration, that an organization may not be able to take us to what we perceive our value could be on the market.
And that expectation should be that they're being transparent with you about that. If they have legitimate constraints and they're being transparent about them, then your next step is to go, I appreciate that. What can we do when the constraints are lifted? When will those constraints be lifted? If you can't do it this year, how can we make sure we close the rest of the gap next year? And I've seen that happen plenty of times with my MBA students as well.
And further to that is that whole question, asking where you are based on the optimum target for the company. I'm seeing a lot more of my friends, we're starting to talk about internally, companies are being more transparent on your 95% of your maximum target. So you're getting a feel for where do you fit in that range or in that band of compensation. Don't be afraid to ask about it. And then you really can understand, well, where am I really? Am I at the top, middle, or bottom end of that? And does that align with my experience and my skill set?
Yeah, I think the key word we've all been saying is transparency. If they're being transparent, there's ways to work it out, and maybe you want to stay there. If they're not, that's a big red flag.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that was all of our questions. Somebody did pop in there to ask if they'll be getting a recording of the session. We do send out a recording to everybody that registered, so you will get one. And I hope you watch it again, because there was so much great information in there. Thank you so much, everybody. It is 5 o'clock now. I'm going to pass it back to Lorene to close us out.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was wonderful. Thanks for our panelists, Dion, Fotini, and Angie for being here. Thank you to all of the attendees. We appreciate you, and we hope that you'll join us for our next event, which is June 1st, our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leadership Forum. Always a very interesting and engaging conversation. Thank you very much, ladies. We really appreciate this tangible, concrete advice, and I hope that that everyone goes out and asks for more than what they're worth. Thanks for being here. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Maya, you can.